Hello,
Hi. Hello, Dr. Campbell. How are you doing? Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine. How have you been? It's a huge pleasure to talk to you again.
Yes, yeah. I've been good. Beautiful day in Florida. Just got out of a meeting with a potential student, so things are good.
Right. And how are you doing with the COVID situation down there?
Um, it's been pretty. I mean, I know for a lot of people it hasn't been good, but I think I had COVID about a year ago. It wasn't too bad. Um, and in general, people don't seem to be too uptight about it around here, which is nice. Like, some
Right.
people fight about everything, and it's been not, I haven't seen a lot of that at my university or just in the circles that I run.
That makes a stressful situation all the more
Yes, it
stressful,
surely is.
right?
And I feel really bad for people that have been in lockdown for month after month. That's very difficult. Again, I haven't experienced that.
Right. So anyway, the topic at hand, sustainable fat loss. I wanted to touch on this topic with you specifically because you have lots and lots of research on the area, and I also um, fairly recently got your latest ebook, which goes
Oh,
all detail, which I'm really enjoying. So thanks for
oh.
that one.
Well, thank you for supporting my work by purchasing that.
A huge pleasure. And also taking into account new year, new me mentality, you know that.
Yes.
So I think this can help a lot of people if we talk about what makes a fat loss phase all the more sustainable, and all the little nuances that go into it. And I'm aware of one video that you did a while ago with the ISSN, I think,
Hmm.
that you mentioned three principles for fat loss, which was, if I remember correctly, the rate of weight loss. It was also the protein intake and also resistance training. So the first principle I wanted to talk to you about is actually that one, the rate of loss. And do you see as a good strategy for some people maybe to be a little bit more aggressive in a diet? Can we begin with those topics, please?
Yeah. So let me just give a little bit of context as to why those three principles exist and why, in particular, the first one's important about your rate of weight loss or fat loss should be slow. And I can say where I maybe changed my mind a little bit on that. The reason that that's important is because when people diet, an uneducated dieter, they won't care if they're losing muscle or fat. They're just happy that they've lost weight. So what we try to do in my research lab and in our approach to things is, if you want to lose weight, we want to make sure that we're targeting body fat, and we want to maintain as much muscle as possible, because muscle is hard to build and we don't want to lose it when dieting. Now, that's not to say that you can't gain it back later, but still, we want to preserve it. And the other thing is, we want to make sure that we keep our metabolic rate as high as possible during and after our diet. When people start making poor dieting decisions, their metabolic rate starts to tank, and that pretty much guarantees that they're going to gain body fat back relatively quickly when their diet is over. So what we try to do is come up with strategies to protect muscle mass and to protect resting metabolic rate during the diet process, so that when you're done with the diet, you've lost fat and you're much more likely to maintain that fat loss. So I just wanted to give that context about
Right.
why rate of weight loss should be slow. Because if the rate of weight loss is too fast, two things will happen. You will lose muscle mass and you will suppress your metabolic rate. So you don't want to take this crash dieting, I'm going to starve myself for 4 weeks type of approach. That actually will work against you in the long term.
What do you think about strategies like mini cuts and what's the name? I think it was proposed by I forgot the name. The protein sparing modified fast that are actually really aggressive and are actually really short, exactly like 4 weeks or so. Are you are you okay with some of the strategies in the context of the same strategies or not really?
Yeah, so that's where I think I've had a little bit of a change of mind over the last year. So I've always said, do take a slow approach to fat loss. That will always be better. And then my lab did a study that challenged this a little over a year and a half ago. It was actually right around when COVID hit. And we said, well, what happens if we do a rapid fat loss protocol, but let's throw everything that we know that will protect muscle mass and that will protect metabolic rate. So what we did, we had a 2-week, pretty severe caloric deficit, nearly 40%. It was 37.5%. Let's just say 40% because it's easier for me to roll it off my tongue. Right. So a near 40% deficit. But what we did during those 2 weeks is we had our subjects, and these were male and female resistance trained people. They had to keep their protein intake high, 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. And they had to continue resistance training. And we supervised them in my lab, at least up until when COVID hit, when we couldn't supervise them anymore. And again, that's a really aggressive approach. And it would have been one that I would have said I wouldn't advise being that aggressive. Typically, I'd like to say 25% caloric deficit, lower than maintenance calories, is a good approach. But at the end of our study, we realized that our subjects did not lose muscle mass. When you accounted for the body water, which we did, we got what we call a dry fat-free mass measure. And they really didn't lose dry fat-free mass over the 2 weeks. So where I've changed my mind is I still say take a slow and sustained approach. But if you are going to take an aggressive fat loss approach, if you're going to do that, make sure that you have high protein. Make sure that you're resistance training to give your body an anabolic stimulus. And then the third thing is make sure it's a short period of time. I think that's the key. We only did a 2-week aggressive caloric deficit. And I think that had a lot. Dr. Forbes is saying also take creatine. Of course, you got to take creatine as well. Creatine will help preserve muscle mass, and he's the creatine king. So
yeah, I know.
I think that timing. So, and one thing I like about this, and I haven't researched this, is I like the fact that if you do this rapid approach and it's short term, people are often going to be motivated when they start their fat loss. So they're going to be more able to handle that severe caloric deficit or aggressive deficit early. And if we can do that, take advantage of that motivation and make sure that it's short enough to really only target fat loss, it may be a good strategy for some people.
How short exactly you think? 4 weeks, 5 weeks, something along those lines?
It's
fine for an aggressive.
2 weeks of that aggressive, and then we backed off for another 2 weeks, and then we went to a 15% on average caloric deficit, and they still maintain their fat loss. So I would almost suggest kind of like you start with a very severe deficit, then a little less, then a little less, and then a little less, and now you're at maintenance calories again. And I would say, again, I'm going to base it on our research, a month, 4 weeks would be that approach. Now, something to consider is when you reduce your calories by 40%, you're going to try to eat 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass, or 2.2, which is also a gram per pound. That's a lot of your calories coming from protein. So that might be 50% of your calories or more in some cases. So you do have to be prepared. Plan your protein intake. So it's like what you said, a protein, protein sparing, modified fast, high protein aspect of this approach.
I remember talking about that. It was like McDonald, right? I first heard from him, the protein.
Yeah, he actually wrote a book. I haven't read it though.
Yeah, sure. It's a short book. I think I have it around there.
Rapid fat loss, right?
Something like that. Yeah. He talked about that.
Yeah.
So do you prefer to talk about percentage of a deficit, or do you like to establish, let's say, a target of rate of weight loss, which I know as far as the literature goes around something 0.5 to 1% of body weight per week, or do you go by the percentage of the deficit?
I think I look at it like this. You prescribe the deficit, and then you monitor the rate of weight loss. So you can try to prescribe your rate of weight loss, but that's going to be hard because everybody responds differently. Even yourself, if I diet this year versus what I did last year versus next year, the same approach, my body may not respond the same way, even though I'm the same human.
Right.
So yeah, I personally prefer let's prescribe a caloric deficit, and then let's use this 1% or 0.5, whatever. Let's see how the prescription is working. And then of course you also want to get a body composition measurement about every 4 weeks to give you more information on, are you targeting fat loss or are we losing more muscle mass? And by the way, let's say that's what's great about doing metabolic rate and a body composition. They're kind of tied. In all of my research, every single one of our studies, when our subjects retained their muscle mass, their metabolic rates were maintained. If they lost muscle mass, their metabolic rates went lower. And if they gained muscle mass, metabolic rates typically went a little bit higher. So resting metabolic rate is a great proxy, a great, substitute measure for what's happening with your retention of skeletal muscle mass.
That's very interesting because that's in line with the next topic I wanted to ask you, which is about adaptive thermogenesis. And that will happen in the long run with weight loss, because it's easy to say, let's just do a deficit, let's roll on and see what happens. But I think it's really important to take into consideration that some of these things can happen, which go by the umbrella term of metabolic adaptations. What are them? What can we do about them? What does the research says? And also studies that can no longer be replicated. I think it was called the Minnesota Starvation trial, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We can no longer replicate that one. So what would happen if one keeps going with the deficit? What are the side effects, to call them that?
Yeah, so if you are going to be in an aggressive caloric deficit for an extended period of time, the research would suggest, and as would my practical experience or observations, you're going to lose muscle mass. That will happen. You're going to suppress your metabolic rate. And then there's two things with that. It makes it more and more difficult to continue losing body fat. There's one. And then two, it makes it much more likely that you're going to gain body fat in the future. Now, the other part of this, which was made very clear in this Minnesota starvation trial and some other research that was aggressive, was when these people lost muscle mass after these aggressive diets, at the end of their diet, they developed hyperphagia, which is an overwhelming desire to eat. It's almost like a ravenous feeling of hunger. And I feel like I'm like that about every weekend, but it is to the, it's just obsessive food, eat food, very high food focused, and you're overeating. And in all of those studies, and again, I'm thinking of a handful where this has been observed, the subjects lost muscle mass. We believe that's what caused this hyperphagic response that caused them to overeat. And within a period of weeks, they had gained more body fat than they had before they started their diet. And we would call that fat overshoot. So you asked, what are the consequences of this? That would be the worst case outcome of that type of approach. You're too aggressive for too long. You lost muscle mass, causing you to overeat in a hyperphagic response, causing excess body fat gain. That's the worst case outcome. Plus, I'm not an exercise psychologist or an eating behavioralist, but then you also have to ask, well, what kind of eating disordered behaviors are becoming prevalent with this as well?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because if I remember correctly, these people in this trial, at one point they used to tell stories about food, what they used to eat, why they like to keep themselves a little bit calm, right?
Yeah, there was some crazy sources. Wait, I'm going to show you. Hold on, I'm going to show you what that study looks like. I have these two books. I don't know if you can see how thick they are.
Yeah.
This is the Minnesota starvation trial that you're talking about. It was
Jesus
not published
Christ.
in a journal. I mean, these are 2 volumes that would take months to get through. It's insane how
Is
much
it is it is it
what's
true that one guy chopped one finger off out of desperation?
I have not read that yet. I haven't gotten through both volumes, but
Right.
yeah,
I heard
that's the
about that
story.
one.
Yeah,
It's
he
really
literally,
crazy.
wasn't sure if it was an accident. Somebody lost the thumb, and they attribute it to excessive hunger, like almost this
Right.
crazy.
Man, it's no laughing matter. In regards to metabolic adaptations, to what extent does metabolic rate decreases? Can we actually measure that? Can we establish, let's say, it goes down by something percent, by some extent of calories? Is there a way
Yeah,
to know that?
yeah, you can measure it in the lab, so we do that, and I can explain how we do that. But the other practical way that you can measure it is with food intake. If you have a suppressed metabolism, you'll gain more body weight or more body fat with the same amount of calories because your metabolism is lower. And I mean, specifically, we'll call that your resting energy expenditure. But you can measure it in the lab. The gold standard method is called direct calorimetry, and that's where you would sit in a closed off room, and it literally measures the amount of heat your body produces. That's a very controlled environment and an expensive setup. What
Right.
what my lab uses, which is what all exercise science labs use, is a indirect calorimetry, where you either put a face mask on over your mouth and nose or a bubble that captures all of the air that you're breathing. And essentially, to say this efficiently, it measures the oxygen that your body consumes. And for every liter of oxygen your body consumes, it's equivalent to burning 5 calories of energy. So you can know how fast or slow your metabolism is by knowing how much oxygen your body is consuming. So that's how
Right.
you can measure it. Um, as an example, if you take 200 milligrams of caffeine for over like a 2 to 3 hour period, your metabolic rate typically increases by like 7%, maybe upwards of 10%. When you, in our study where we did this rapid fat loss, again, nearly a 40% deficit, after 2 weeks, metabolic rate was significantly lower. It was like 5% lower, even though they did maintain muscle mass.
Right. And it's a little convoluted topic because out of the top of my mind, I remember a study that said metabolic adaptation is an illusion. That was the actual title of the study. Metabolic adaptation is an illusion, because we can think that, okay, if one person begins weighing, I don't know, 70 kilo and then goes down to 60, it's a smaller person. It has a smaller expenditure, and maybe it's not a metabolic adaptation. It's a smaller person. Can we elaborate a little bit on that? Because
Yeah,
it's a
and
little, it's still a little confusing. I'm sorry. Yeah.
yeah, I definitely can elaborate, and need to be honest. I'm aware of that study. I have not read it, and I think that was published last year in
Yeah, it's fairly
2020.
recent. Right.
So I'm not speaking specifically of the arguments they're raised because I haven't read that. But when let's just say we use your example, if you go from 70 to 60 kgs, your metabolic rate, your resting energy expenditure, it would go down because you are a smaller person. If you go from 70 kgs to 80 kgs, you gained weight. Now your resting energy expenditure is going to go up. So this metabolic adaptation doesn't describe a situation where your metabolic rate goes down, because it does go down with weight loss. It describes, did it go down more than what you would predict based on your weight loss? So as an example,
Right. Right.
if you go from 70 kgs to 60 kgs, let's just say that's 10 units of weight loss. You would expect your metabolic rate to go down 10 units as an example. But if your metabolic rate went down 15 units instead of 10, that's 5 extra units that are unaccounted for, that are not related to your body weight. So we would say there's this negative metabolic adaptation, or that negative outcome of the weight loss.
Right. And what is the role of hormones in all this, in all this madness, specifically leptin and sex hormones? To what extent is it a response of hormones or the other way around?
Yeah, I'm glad you phrased it like that. I have the opinion that your hormones are responding to your caloric deficit or your energy deficit. Your
Right.
hormones are kind of reacting to your energy output, or the let's just call it the energy deficit. I don't believe your hormones are running the show, so to speak. And I'm not going to claim to have expert knowledge in hormones. I don't. But we can pretty much predict if you go into a caloric deficit, especially in the more severe cases of, let's say, bodybuilding contest preparation, we
Sure.
pretty much can predict what will happen to the hormones. And then after the diet is over and you start gaining body weight back, you also can predict what will happen to them. So I look at the hormones as following, not orchestrating the adaptations that are occurring within a diet.
Right. And in regards now to protein intake, because we can talk about protein in regards to increasing rate of muscle protein synthesis, obviously in conjunction with resistance training, but we can also talk about the thermic effect of food. Can we elaborate about those two? Why
Yeah.
is it important in a fat loss phase?
So with high protein, let's just compare protein to carbs and fat. Whenever you eat anything, you are going to increase your body's metabolism because your body has to work to digest, absorb, transport, and uptake whatever food or calories you just consumed. It just so happens that protein increases the metabolism of your body significantly more than fat and carbs. In fact, protein is about a 25% increase in the amount of calories needed to digest the protein. So let me explain it like this. If I take 100 calories of pure protein, it's going to cause my body to use 25 calories just to digest that protein and absorb it. So that only leaves 75 calories left over. Fat and carbs are like, 5%, and fat's like 2%. So they do not increase your body's metabolism very much. The main reason why it's so different is protein has peptide bonds, which is like a nitrogen-nitrogen bond. That's a strong bond. It takes energy to break that bond. And when you break that bond, that's more heat, and heat is metabolism. So now that when you have a high protein diet and you lose body fat, I believe that some of that, not a lot, but some of that is because you're actually burning more calories to deal with this high protein diet.
Can we view that as a strategy to increase protein because of that thermic effect of food increase? Or maybe it's just it has a higher thermic effect of food, but maybe it's not really significant.
Yeah, well, I think you can look at it as a strategy. The only question I would have is how much is that contributing to excess fat loss? So the obesity research is very clear. A higher protein diet in obese people is going to cause greater fat loss and a greater muscle retention. Again, very consistent. Even in lean people, there's a handful of studies, less than 5, where higher protein intake causes more fat loss and retains muscle mass greater. The question is how much of that is attributed to the thermic effect? I don't know, but again, some of it is, in my opinion, is going to be responsible for that effect. So there is no question that a higher protein diet will improve body composition, whether you're losing body fat or even maintaining your current body weight. So here's something I used to do when I was a trainer. I would still do this if I worked with clients, which I don't. I would tell people, hey, we're just going to change your food a little bit, and we're not going to cut your calories at all. And what I would do is just replace some carbs or potentially some fat, but usually carbs, with the same amount of protein. So eat a little less spaghetti and eat a little bit more salmon, let's say, throughout the week, whatever their natural food selections were. My observations of these clients, they always improved their body composition, and we did not decrease their calories. We just increased protein.
Is this called or is it the same as the protein leverage hypothesis in obesity treatment?
Yeah, it's not. The way I understand that, it's a little different, which is a really cool area of research. The
Sure.
way that I understand the protein leverage hypothesis is everybody is going to have, and let's say a given amount of hunger, and according to this theory, when you get enough protein, that hunger starts to slow down. It starts to lessen. So you want to leverage protein. Make sure you get enough protein to help control your hunger. If you're not eating much protein in your diet, you have higher levels of hunger all day. And usually what happens is you're going to overeat on food and then you gain body fat. So that kind of says make sure that you get enough protein because that will cause less hunger throughout the day. And we do know
Yeah.
protein is the most satiating macronutrient. It does make you feel the fullest, the longest. At least the research would always say that it does that, or it's never any worse. Some
Right.
research would suggest that it's no different, but other research says protein more satiating for a longer period of time.
Really interesting.
And
The
just
next
think,
topic.
let
No,
me just
yes, go
say
ahead.
this. So far we mentioned like 4 things about protein. It preserves your muscle mass.
Right.
It helps preserve your metabolic rate. It increases muscle protein synthesis. It helps you feel fuller longer, and it increases the thermic effect of the food. So we looked at all of these things where protein. You kind of get the message. Maybe you should have a higher, again, if your goal is to live a little bit of a leaner physique than what you would otherwise, if that's your goal. I'm led to, the evidence leads me to believe, yeah, that a higher protein diet is beneficial for that goal.
Do you think the 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram is a good ballpark
Yes,
for
I
this
think
effect?
that's a great, that's a great,
Right.
that's a great range. Some people struggle to get 2.2, but if they can hit 1.6, the research would suggest that that's probably enough to maximize your muscle mass adaptations to resistance training. I personally like to go higher. I think there is a greater benefit to going higher, but the
Higher
higher and
than.
higher you go, the less and less of a benefit you get. So it's not like
Right.
you get a huge benefit from 1.2 to 1.6. You get a small benefit from 1.6 to 2.0. And that's my opinion.
But are you referring to going higher from 2.2
I
or in that range?
No, I think I don't believe there's harm in going higher. I think that
Right.
would be very difficult for most people. Bodybuilders, the exception, can some of them can do that without striving. Uh, yeah, I wouldn't have a problem with it.
Right.
I do think though that that's a difficult ask for most people, at least the people that I would tend to work with.
It wouldn't be a problem for Jose Antonio, the 4 grams per kilogram. I know he could
Yeah.
do that on all, all the subjects on the studies. The next
And
topic I wanted to ask you about, it's one of the studies you conducted with Lauren Colvin about flexible versus rigid dieting, because I think it's one of a kind study. At least I'm not aware of many of that kind. Can we define what is flexible and rigid? Because sometimes we make the mistake of assuming that flexible, it's if it fits your macros, but being stressed out about a certain number, a certain macro target, that you can eat whatever as long as you're in that macro target, but maybe that's not as flexible as we think. And what is a rigid in the context of this study?
yeah, let me just mention, yeah, Lauren Conlon, that was her research study. She coordinated that study, designed the study. She did a great job. And she was a former master's student of mine. And I think Brooke is one of my current master's students. I think I saw her. She was on here as well. I'm going to just globally explain the difference between flexible and rigid as most people would understand it. And then we can get a little
Sure.
bit more nuanced. So a rigid diet would be, again, making this easy to explain. You eat the same thing all the time. It's oatmeal for breakfast and chicken breast and broccoli for lunch and fish and
Like a meal
asparagus.
plan.
What's that?
right? Like a meal plan
Yes.
you have
Yep.
in your refrigerator. Okay,
Exactly.
right,
Meal plan that doesn't change. It's rigid.
sure.
Whereas, and then the other extreme is flexible dieting, where the foods could always change. You could eat oatmeal for breakfast one day, Cheerios another day, or eggs a third day, toast another day. So there's a big difference globally. Rigid never changes, flexible, all kinds of substitutions. Now, some people would suggest that flexible is always changing, but the reality is, if you are in the more of a caloric deficit you're in, even a flexible diet, you start to lose a lot of choices. There's only so many things you can eat in our rapid fat loss study. Even though we said eat anything you want, I can tell you, because I did the protocol myself, I was eating tuna every day to hit my protein goals while
You did
reducing my calories.
you did the 40% deficit?
Yeah, yep.
What were you eating? Just tuna and vegetables, I assume.
I actually did not have many vegetables for those
All right.
2 weeks. Yeah, I'm kind of embarrassed that I didn't, but I want to be honest. I had a Fairlife milk. I remember that. I think my calories were around 1,400 or 14 or 1,500. Yeah, but tuna, eggs. I had protein shakes to obviously hit my protein. Just a lot of that, a lot of the same
I
thing.
feel you. I
Chicken
feel you.
breast. Yes.
Right.
So, and then just to get into, a flexible diet doesn't always mean that it can't be rigid. Some people are, they also get into a very rigid mindset, even within a flexible dieting approach.
Right. Can we think about maybe a conclusion from this, the long term versus the short term? Because maybe for someone that is starting with all the fat loss process, it's easier to go by a rigid plan that just tells them what to eat, the portions, and that's it. But maybe in the long run, we can benefit from learning about macros, from learning about certain caloric targets. Can we extrapolate this conclusion?
Yeah, let me answer that just with kind of what would be my approach if I were working with clients. I would start somebody who knows nothing about food with a rigid plan. Tell me what you eat. So I would ask for
Sure.
give me a list of foods that you normally eat, because I don't want to change a lot about what they do. And I would just say, hey, let's eat more of this today, less of this, but it's the same foods. Here's a meal plan. And then as they become comfortable with this, then I think I would want to switch them to flexible dieting, because flexible dieting to me means you're an educated dieter. You can't do flexible dieting and not appreciate what's a carb, what's a protein, and what is a fat. It's very, it's just, to me, it's the best education you're ever going to get on food, because again, flexible dieting usually implies that you're tracking macros, like macro tracking. And then once they kind of master that skill set, and I would say do that for several months, in a perfect world, now they can go back to eating foods and not necessarily track macros again, because they understand what it is. They have an idea of what a serving size of something looks like. Now, I will tell you, I can't do that. Every time I don't track, I lose my discipline. I start to gain body fat. So if I'm not tracking, I'm gaining body fat. Now, I don't know, maybe that's a crutch. I don't know. I just embrace it. I'm like, yeah, I'm going to track. And I like numbers, so it's enjoyable to me. I'm maybe a little obsessive with numbers, but I am a scientist. So,
Makes sense.
yeah. And I also wanted to say, in that study, because we didn't mention this, what we demonstrated was whether you do flexible dieting or a more rigid plan where somebody gives you a meal plan, both were equally effective for fat loss. There was not, one of those was not better than the other. So if you prefer a meal plan or you prefer a flexible dieting approach, both are equally effective as long as you're in a caloric deficit to lose body fat.
Right. And one of the next topics that I wanted to ask you that we discussed actually on the first live stream we did, strategies like, let's say, refits. We talk in great detail about those one, about also diet breaks that later on the very same year came the Jackson Pio study, which I think is really interesting. I think we can talk a little bit about that. And one of the strategies that me personally, I don't like them that much, cheat meals. Can we talk about when to implement each of one of the strategies, why, and for who can benefit most from each of one of the strategies?
Yeah, let's start with well, I like to describe them. The overwhelming strategy is called non-linear dieting. So most people, they think of going on a diet, they're just going to stay dieting for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. A non-linear dieting approach is don't be in a caloric deficit for month after month. Take some time off, whether it's a day a week, 2 days per week, maybe 2 weeks off. So you kind of have this, ebb and flow of your dieting your dieting phase or your fat loss phase. I think that it's probably better to start with a diet refeed. What we did with research was we tried to mimic what people do naturally, and what most people do naturally is they increase their calories on the weekends. So what we did, and we published this study in I think it was 2020. We designed a diet that mimicked how people normally eat. We made them diet harder during the week, Monday through Friday. And then on the weekends, when they would naturally want to eat more food, we planned that. We said, increase your calories on the weekend, go back to maintenance calories. And what we found in that study was it was no better for fat loss. Both approaches caused equal amount of fat loss, but the refeed approach actually caused a greater retention of muscle mass and a greater retention of metabolic rate. So it actually was a little bit better. And these were all resistance trained people, by the way. So the first application is for refeeds. I think that's a good lifestyle approach. So like right now, I gained about 10 pounds, about 4 kgs over the last few months. So during the week right now, I'm dieting a little bit. Then on the weekends, I'm increasing. And I'm just going to keep doing this till I slowly lose the body fat that I gained. So it's just part of my lifestyle. The other approach that you mentioned was a diet break. Oh, and I see Shakti Fitness also. That's somebody that I've talked to before. They're doing a similar thing. And again, I like that for my lifestyle approach. A diet break is typically going to be 1 or 2 weeks off. Like you're no longer dieting. You're taking a break from the diet. And I think the best application of that is when you are in a fat loss phase, you're reducing your calories, and you get to the point where you're hitting a plateau, where you're still in a deficit, but you're no longer losing body fat. I think that's a good time to reassess things and take a break and then come back. And when I say take a break, just go back to what used to be your maintenance calories, so you're not gaining all of your body fat back. And it's possible that this diet break would reset your plateau, so where now when you go back on the diet, you may be able to lose body fat again. Now, some research says that happens, at least in obese males. We have some research. Other research says it doesn't happen, but the research has never reported that it sets you back, that it is worse for you. So it's either better or it's not going to help at all.
Right. So can we think about refits as a lifestyle tool, like you said, and then diet breaks maybe like a tool for when you encounter some sort of resistance, some sort of friction that you're no longer losing weight, then you can apply these strategies? Or how can we guide our decision making in either taking refits or diet breaks?
I would always advocate letting the decisions be guided by your clients' preferences. So Do they want to eat more on the weekends? If they do, then make that part of their plan. If they are in a fat loss phase and they're going to plan on going on vacation, plan to make that a diet break week or two. Like that, there's nothing worse than trying to diet on vacation. I know I've done it and I'm miserable, and I usually fail. So I've learned I'm gonna plan around that. So I love working with a client. Where are your natural lifestyle decisions and habits, and we're going to design a plan around that, not around what the research says. Now we're going to use the principles from the research. So that would be my answer to that. Hopefully that answered your question.
All right, very interesting. And I think it's a really practical way to guide our decision making. And lastly, if you have the time, of course, I would like to discuss the role of training in regards to resistance training, but also aerobic exercise, because for some people, aerobic exercise is their go-to tool for weight loss, which now we know that maybe it's not as effective as some people still think. And why is resistance training such an important tool for preserving our lean body mass?
Resistance training imparts an anabolic stimulus on the body that aerobic exercise does not. So if you are reducing your calories, you're in a caloric deficit. I describe that as it's a catabolic environment. It's catabolic all the time. So if you can do anything to help yourself, or if you can introduce any type of anabolic stimulus, that would be a great thing. So what we know is an anabolic stimulus is two things: resistance training, massive anabolic stimulus on the body, and protein intake. Protein is protein increases muscle protein synthesis. So hence, and once again, I'll go back to where we started. When you're dieting, high protein and resistance training both introduce these periodic anabolic stimuli to the body in an otherwise catabolic environment.
Why do you think that is that some people still insist on the importance, on the set importance of aerobic training for weight loss?
I have a couple thoughts on that. First thing is aerobic training for most people is easier. Right. It's not as painful. Like lifting weights, to me, it just hurts. Like my muscles burn. I could drop a weight on my head and crush my skull. Like I guess I could fall if I'm running. So I think for a lot of people, it's just not a natural mode of exercise.
Right, makes
now,
sense.
I will push back and say that aerobic exercise is a great fat loss activity. A lot of people will say, they'll point to research literature, and they can rightfully point to, a lot of studies. Look, here's an aerobic exercise program, and there was no weight loss. So it doesn't even work for fat loss. And what they fail to realize is they actually did lose fat, but aerobic exercise caused some muscle gain. So it looked like there was no weight change, which there wasn't, but they actually improved their body composition. So aerobic exercise is a great strategy to induce fat loss, but it shouldn't be in my opinion, and again, I guess this would apply to people who care about their physiques, who want to maintain muscle mass or build more muscle. That should be the foundation of your exercise lifestyle. You're always, throughout the year, you're going to be resistance training. That's a foundational component of your life. But aerobic exercise, I think, has a lot of value. At certain points of the year when you want to lose body fat, go ahead and do that in addition to or in place of a caloric deficit. It should cause fat loss. The research shows that. And I think aerobic exercise gets a bad reputation. And it comes from people not appreciating the difference between weight loss and fat loss. And then the second thing is people just doing tons of cardiovascular exercise and never trying to increase muscle mass.
Right. And what do you think is the role of NEAT, this component of total energy expenditure, maybe in absence of aerobic training? Or in conjunction also, can we increase the rate of fat loss by increasing the NEAT component?
Yeah, yeah. If you could increase anything on the energy outcome or the energy expenditure side of the equation, that should result in fat loss. So NEAT is non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or not, I like to call it non-exercise energy expenditure. So it's the calories that you're burning when you're not sleeping and when you're not exercising. So it's just this all around, it's just your calories, like right for me right now, this would be my NEAT. I'm not exercising and I'm not sleeping. And yeah, and if you can increase that, it should cause a loss of body fat. Now that's where resistance training has a little bit of a positive outcome. If you increase your muscle mass, you increase your NEAT. Now it's not as much as what we used to think, but there's still, a portion of increased
Right.
muscle mass will burn more calories.
Right. And in regards to resistance training, how do you like to manipulate the variables? Do you think there's a solid argument saying that maybe in a deficit we should increase training volume to counterbalance muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown? Or maybe the meta-analytic recommendations of something along 10 sets per muscle per week it still applies, either it's in a deficit or in a surplus?
I would answer that by defining my population. So if somebody's competing for getting ready to do a bodybuilding show, what's typically going to happen is they're going to increase volume of everything: resistance training, aerobic training, while dieting. Outside of that, my advice would be don't increase your volume of resistance training. Keep that the same so that your intensity can be as high as possible. If you're in a caloric deficit, well, first of all, we're assuming that this person wants to lose body fat. So right now we're going to put you in the fat loss phase category. You should reduce your calories. That's the most effective thing. You should continue to resistance train, but don't use resistance training as part of your fat loss plan. That is your muscle maintenance. That is just your core, your lifestyle exercise. I would suggest adding an aerobic exercise to your caloric deficit, because your goal is to lose body fat. Now, some people will say, well, won't that cause me to lose more muscle mass? And I'm going to say no. The research has not reported that across the board. Now, we are lacking research in highly trained, or let's say bodybuilders. But if you look at the case study research, we have about 10 different athletes that are preparing for bodybuilding competitions, 5 males, 5 females. Females never lose muscle mass, even with high amounts of cardio, as long as they're resistance training. Males always lose muscle mass, but we also have to appreciate their diet, their calories are very low. High volume resistance training, high volume cardio, typically.
Right. So just to finish off, could you give us some general fat loss recommendations in regards to rate of loss, protein intake, maybe the minimal fat intake, and some brief resistance training guidelines?
Yeah, I would suggest a 25% caloric deficit. I would start there. I would aim for 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. Aim up to that. If you can't do that, at least 1.6 grams per kg. I would suggest no more than 1% of body weight loss per week. And if you do though, and if you're continuing to resistance train, you can be pretty confident that your weight loss is coming almost solely from body fat stores. That's what the research informs us. In terms of, I think you also asked about resistance training.
Yeah,
I
sure.
would suggest keeping your intensity high. And I look at intensity as my proximity to failure. So take every set to within 1 or 2 repetitions shy of failure, at least, well, let's say most of your sets.
Right.
Occasionally go ahead and go to failure. And if you're really dragging on a particular day, stop 3 or 4 reps shy of failure. But in general, the most of your training should be at a pretty high effort, such that you're 1 or 2 repetitions shy of failure. Did that address everything that you asked?
Yeah, totally. But do you have any training volume guidelines in the context of a deficit?
Uh,
I know it's a tough question, but I
yeah.
just wanted to ask you.
Yeah, my opinion would be, and I'm not aware of any research that looked at training volume in a caloric
Right.
deficit. But my opinion would be that that decision should be based on what your training volume was. So it would be
All right.
very individualistic. So if you are in your maintenance phase, you're not trying to lose fat, and let's say you're doing 15 sets per body part, I would suggest being right around 15 sets per body part during the fat loss phase, because you're in a fat loss phase. So do cardio in a fat loss phase. When you're done, you have your body fat where you want it. I do think the research informs me that slow and small increases in training volume will lead to more muscle hypertrophy. You got to be careful though, because if you keep increasing by 10% every month, that becomes unsustainable very quickly. So
Correct.
very small increases in volume over time would be my advice.
Very well. So I think that covers it. I just want to thank you again, and I can recommend your latest ebook enough. It's been really enjoyable. I'm still not through it because it's quite extensive, but I'm really enjoying it, learning a lot. And thanks for your time. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah,
So I hope
thank
you
you.
have a no, thanks to you, and I hope we can do this again some other time. And hope you have a great start of the year and a great rest of the day, Dr.
I
Campbell.
will. Thank you so much, man.
Thanks to you. Have a great day.
You too.